Daniel chapter 5, numbered, weighed, and lacking. An interesting story that Daniel gives us about the time of transition for the Babylonian kingdom. Daniel chapter 5, verse 1 starts out, King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords, his governors, his officials, and drank wine in front of the 1,000. Now, first off, we see that we're talking not here about King Nebuchadnezzar anymore. This is King Belshazzar. Nebuchadnezzar is now done as far as storyline goes. He is no longer king. He's died. Belshazzar comes sometime later. If you remember, in the first lesson, we had a storyline or a timeline that looks kind of like this, where you had Nebuchadnezzar reigning for a number of years. He was really the one that solidified the empire and made it the great world power, superpower that it was. The next couple of years, over the next 6 or so years, we had a bunch of little tiny kings in the middle. They didn't last very long. They were not super notable. They didn't reign a long time. They didn't accomplish much. And then we had Nabonidus and Belshazzar. From what I've read, there are conflicting reports, of course, exactly who both of these people were. But they think that Belshazzar was actually the son of Nabonidus and also was related in some way, possibly a grandson, Belshazzar was, to Nebuchadnezzar. Kind of speculation, depends on who you read, from what. But the point I'm trying to make here is Nebuchadnezzar is gone, and now we're dealing with kind of the end of the kingdom, the end of the Babylonian Empire. So King Belshazzar, he's the one that made a great feast. And he held a feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. So he's putting on a great, big, huge feast for everyone. Here. Verse 2 continuing. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, that the king and his lords, his wives, his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. And they drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. So he's having this massive party. And again, from extra biblical sources, they kind of think that this would have been the time of one of the feasts to their pagan gods. So they're holding this religious feast, and Belshazzar, he's enjoying himself, maybe a little bit too much, and he says, hey, I got a great idea. Let's bring out the super fancy tableware. I know of some that would fit just right for this occasion. My grandfather or predecessor, however the relation was, Nebuchadnezzar, brought these from the temple in Israel, in Jerusalem. And let's bring out these gold and silver bowls used for worship in that day, and we'll use them for worship in our day as well. Only not to worship the God of Israel. We're going to drink and have a good time in honor of our pagan gods. This is kind of a strange time, again, from what I've read historically, to be holding a feast because the Babylonian Empire was under attack by what we know would be the next reigning power, the Medes and the Persians. I don't know if you remember back in the story of when Jerusalem, Israel and Judah were taken down, but oftentimes the opposing armies would come into the countryside. They'd basically kind of work towards the capital city, and they'd just take all the cities in between. So you start at the outside of the kingdom, you work your way in towards the central capital city, taking out all the towns and villages and everything else that's in your way. Usually the last to fall is the most strongly fortified city, usually the capital. And so the rest of the nation is gone, and the army surrounds the capital city and usually some kind of siege formation, and they just kind of attack the city, and then the city is the last to fall, and then the empire is declared gone. And that's kind of, again, from what I've read, there's a lot of conflicting reports, but what was going on here? Apparently, much of the Babylonian Empire had already been taken over by the Medes and the Persians. And the city proper was about the last one standing. So it's kind of strange that the king would be holding a festival and a feast and a big party at a time when the army was already attacking, the city is already under siege, and things are already not looking all that good. I did put in here kind of a map of what they think the city of Babylon looked like at that time. You can see that big blue ribbon, that's the Euphrates River running down. They believe it ran right through the center of the city, based on the archaeology and everything they've found, right through the center of the city. And kind of that, not quite a square, but that weird-shaped city proper there. The river ran through the middle. There was walls on either side of the river. I think I mentioned before how Nebuchadnezzar had fortified the walls not only around the city but also along the river, so that if you pass through the river, you look on both sides and there's the beautiful mosaic and the glazed bricks and the gorgeous architecture. Everything about the city was gorgeous, but also very, very well fortified. Beyond that, off to the right, you can see kind of a diagonal, almost arrow-shaped lines. That's another set of walls that Nebuchadnezzar also constructed. And the idea was that obviously the river is there to kind of protect the one side. I'm not explaining this real well. They can't get in through the river because it's a river and you can easily blow people up if they try to swim. I'm sure they had gates or guards or gratings across the river so you couldn't get into the city that way. And also around the outside, they had this walled-in area outside of the city proper, and you see it's all kind of green and lush looking. That was so that if for whatever reason the city ever was under siege, the army not only couldn't get into the city, they couldn't even get into that outside area. And that outside area could be used for growing crops, providing food for everybody in the city, almost with the idea that it could withstand siege almost indefinitely because it had its own source of water, the Euphrates, and it could grow its own food from all that cropland that was still walled in outside the city. And so it was a very, very, very tough city to conquer. I looked up on worldhistory.org here. It says that Nebuchadnezzar built 3 walls around Babylon, so broad at the top that chariots could race around the top of them. So wide and so strong they were. The Ishtar Gate, which is one of the main gates leading into the city, in the wall of Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon, was claimed by some to be greater than any of the listed wonders of the ancient world. It was not just a gate like the swinging part unhinged. It was this basically a fortress where you had to enter through the city, and it was so wide so that you had to go through kind of a built tunnel to get into the city. And of course, obviously, if you're in a defensive position, you could have your soldiers lining that whole corridor, making it impossible for people to go through. Maybe it had slits or windows or something to fire through. Who knows? But very, very impressive fortification. The Greek historian Herodotus claimed that Babylon surpasses in wonder any city in the known world, and specifically praised the walls, which he said were 56 miles long, 80 feet thick, and 320 feet high. Now he says, although it's generally believed that Herodotus exaggerated the majesty of Babylon, other ancient writers have also noted the magnificent walls. And it's true. Apparently, depending on which ancient source you read is how high the walls were. You know how it goes. And they think that he might have been overestimating a little bit. And that's fine, whatever. But the point is, Babylon was really well built and very well fortified. And so even though the rest of the empire was under siege and under attack, and the opposing army had already come in and wiped much of it out, Belshazzar apparently was still in a pretty good mood, and he said, we're going to hold our religious feast anyway. We're going to make it a big, grand event. We're going to host 1,000 of our governors. Even though the army is encamped outside, we are safe and secure in our well-fortified fortress city. And we know they're not going to get in because we're indestructible. Continuing on. So he brings out, as part of the party, the articles from the God of Israel, from Jerusalem. And they bring these out and they start worshiping their false gods using the temple articles that they brought. Continue in verse 5. Immediately, as this was going on, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, opposite of the lampstand. This is a place that apparently would have been well lit, probably central to the room. Everybody could see it. And the king saw the hand as it wrote. Then the king's color changed, and his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. The king called loudly to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers. The king declared to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold round his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king the interpretation. Then Belshazzar was greatly alarmed, and his color changed, and his lords were perplexed. And they're having a feast, and maybe everybody's a little tipsy anyway, but all of a sudden, on the plaster wall there, right in a prominent position, a hand shows up and it just starts writing on the wall these letters. And he goes pale, and he starts shaking, and he doesn't know what to do, so terrified. And he calls in everyone he can find, all of his wise men, just like his grandfather or predecessor had done, calling all the wise men to help solve this problem as soon as he could. And none of them could do it. And again, I have to kind of wonder, where is Daniel at this point? Why wasn't he one of the first ones called in again? This seems to happen over and over. And at first they think, well, several kings have gone by, maybe they don't know him, and yet we can see later in the passage he knew full well who Daniel was and of his reputation. Why did he not call him right away? I'm not sure. We could speculate. But continuing on in verse 10, the queen, again, possibly we think maybe his mother, Belshazzar's mother, we don't know for sure, but again, that sounds likely, because of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banqueting hall. And the queen declared, O king, live forever. Let not your thoughts alarm you or your color change. Stop being so pale. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. In the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom like the wisdom of the gods were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians. And again, probably there's not talking about biological father, although, again, there's some disagreement. Time-wise, it probably would have worked if there's only about 6 years between the end of Nebuchadnezzar's reign and the start of Belshazzar or Nabonidus' reign. I'll let you decide on that. Your father the king made him, Daniel, chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and astrologers, because an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. And the queen has to come in, who is obviously a generation older probably than Belshazzar, and she remembered everything that Daniel had done, and she said, "Oh, king, we have an answer here, or at least we know who can give you the answer to what's going on the wall. Call in Daniel." And you have to wonder at this point, does the king start to put together the fact that they just brought out the Israelite cups, and now they're having to bring in the Israelite prophet? I wonder if he correlates that. My guess is no, but you wonder if he starts putting two and two together there. And Daniel comes in, and as he always does, he has the answer, but it's fascinating to me that before he even provides the interpretation of the writing, he provides the purpose and the meaning of it, and then the interpretation. Look at what Daniel says here. Verse 13. Then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king answered and said to Daniel, "You are that Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, whom the king my father brought from Judah. I have heard of you, that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you." So clearly the king did know who he was, at least intellectually. Verse 15, "Now the wise men, the enchanters, have been brought in before me to read this writing and make known to me its interpretation. But they could not show the interpretation of the matter. But I have heard that you can give interpretations and solve problems. Now if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom." So he brings Daniel in. He says, "I know who you are. I know what you can do. I need you to read this for me to solve this problem. And if you do, you'll be given all kinds of riches, rewards. You'll be made the third ruler of the kingdom." Third, who were the first two? The first two would have been probably, they think, Nabonidus and Belshazzar. Again, if they're a father-son duo, oftentimes, maybe they're kind of co-reigning. Maybe Nabonidus was out with the army while Belshazzar took care of things in the city. We don't know exactly how it worked out. But for whatever reason, Daniel would be number 3 after those top two. Verse 17. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, "Let your gifts be for yourself, and give your rewards to another. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father kingship and greatness and glory and majesty. And because of the greatness that he gave him, all the peoples, nations, languages trembled before him and feared him. Whom he would, he killed, and whom he would, he kept alive. Whom he would, he raised up, and whom he would, he humbled. Nebuchadnezzar could do whatever he wanted, and that's because God gave him the power and the authority to do so. Verse 20, but when his heart was lifted up, and his spirit was hardened so that he dealt proudly, he was brought down from his kingly throne, and his glory was taken from him. He was driven from among the children of mankind, and his mind was made like that of a beast, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. He was fed grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, until he knew that the Most High God rules the kingdom of mankind and sets over it whom he will. He says, Belshazzar, read your history books, or better yet, read Daniel chapter 4, because it talks all about this. He says, you should know better than this. Nebuchadnezzar, your father, predecessor, whatever, the king before you, the great king before you, he had to deal with this God. Why did you not learn from his mistakes, learn from what he had to go through? You should know better than this. And instead of praising the God of Israel that Nebuchadnezzar commanded that everybody worship, or at least reverence, you're back to worshiping your idols. And not only that, you're bringing out the God of Israel's articles from the temple made for his worship. You're using them to worship the false idols. You're disrespecting the God of Israel in order to worship your own gods. You should know better, is what he says. Verse 22, and you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this. But you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven. And the vessels of his house have been brought in before you, and your lords and your wives and your concubines have drunk wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, of iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know, but the God in whose hands is your breath, and whose are all your ways, you have not honored. Again, Belshazzar, you should know better than this. The God who controls everything, even according to your own king, Nebuchadnezzar, that God you've disregarded, you've forgotten about him, you dishonor him. You bring out his hardware and you use them to sacrifice to your gods. You should know better than this. Now again, keep in mind, Daniel gives this whole big long history speech and kind of scolds the king while the writing is still right there on the wall. Everybody is still shaking and everybody wants to know what the writing means. And he pauses before he even interprets the writing to give really what the writing was all about, right? That's really the point of why God came and wrote on the wall. He said, you should know better than this. You're worshiping the wrong God, and now I'm going to have to do something about it. At that point, Daniel finally kind of turns and says, all right, now I'll tell you what the writing says. Verse 24. Then from his presence, that's the God of Israel, was sent, and this writing is inscribed. And this is the writing that was inscribed. Mene, mene, tekel, parsin. And this is the interpretation of the matter. And it seems like this is kind of an accounting terminology. Again, you read a lot of different kind of sub-interpretations of what it means. Obviously, Daniel gives the point of the story right here in the passage. But kind of accounting talks about weighing, it talks about measuring, it talks about counting. Even the words here sound similar to like the Jewish monetary, the minas, the shekels. Things like that, weighed up, accounting. Verse 26, this is the interpretation of the matter, meaning God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. He says, Belshazzar, God has weighed you up like coins in the scale. You're buying something in the market, and God has weighed your performance. He's numbered your days. He's numbered your days, and he has ended them. He's counted you like pennies on a scale, or like quarters at the dime store, or whatever you want to say. You're making a purchase, and God has counted up your days. Your days are numbered, and that number is very small at this point. Next word, verse 27. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. After we've counted up the change, think of like going to Grandma's Pantry or the store up here, right? And you're going to buy a bag of flour. Does anybody buy bags? Yeah, we buy our flour from Grandma's Pantry, I think. So I'm going up there to buy a 5-pound bag of flour. I've got some cash in my pocket. I pull it out. I try to get exact change. I pull out some coins, and I'm like 3 pennies short. And I say, grr. In fact, actually, I did that just the other day. Went up to buy donuts. My wife set me up for donuts, right? And I had a $5 bill, and I wish I had just a couple more quarters so I didn't have to break another $5 bill. Yeah, that's the way it goes. But I was a few coins short, and so we counted them out. Oh no, I'm short. Now what do I do? Second word, tekel, weighed. You have been weighed and come up short. I've counted them. Now he's insufficient. God has said, you should know better. You should have performed better than this. I gave enough signs to your predecessor, Nebuchadnezzar. You know who I am. You know the history between us, between me and your country, your nation. But your performance is lacking. You've not been the king that you should have been. And finally, the third term, Perez. Verse 28, Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Perez, meaning divided. He divided the kingdom, and Perez, again, according to what I've read, also sounds very close to the word for Persians. And so he's kind of making a double play here. But it's divided just like the kingdom to come will be divided, Medes and Persians. But he has divided the kingdom, your kingdom, in half, given it to the Medes and the Persians. Your performance has been counted. Your performance is lacking. It's insufficient. And because of this, God has taken the kingdom from you and given it to somebody else. Kind of interestingly, Belshazzar still gives Daniel the rewards that he promised him, even though Daniel earlier on had said, you can keep your rewards, I don't want them. Whether that was because Daniel was kind of, again, like he did earlier in the chapter, saying, I don't want your wicked proceeds from what you're doing to be credited to my account, or whether he knew that anything that Belshazzar would give him at that point would be irrelevant anyway because his time was up. Maybe both, probably both, we don't know. But verse 29, Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed with purple, and a chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made about him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. Verse 30, that very night Belshazzar the Chaldean king was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Apparently, that very time, even as the party was going on, Nabonius, the other, probably number one ruler of the kingdom, according to historians, likely was already captured. He was being deported to another part of the kingdom, wherever the Medes and the Persians wanted him to be. He wasn't killed, but he was kind of exiled there and made to work in the Persian government. And like I said, the city of Babylon was the last one standing in the siege. They were about to fall. According to, again, what we read from history, I got this from worldhistory.org, says the Neo-Babylonian Empire continued after the death of Nebuchadnezzar, and Babylon continued to play an important role in the region under the rule of Nabonidus and his successor, or co-ruler, either way, Belshazzar, featured in the book of Daniel. In 539 BC, the empire fell to the Persians under Cyrus the Great at the Battle of Opis. Babylon's walls were impregnable, and so the Persians cleverly devised a plan whereby they diverted the course of the Euphrates River so that it fell to a manageable depth. While the residents of the city were distracted by one of their religious feast days, which is what we just read about in Daniel chapter 5, the Persian army waded the river and marched right under the walls of Babylon unnoticed. It was claimed that the city was taken without a fight, although the documents at the time indicate that repairs had to be made to the walls, some section of the city, so perhaps the action was not quite as effortless as the Persian accounts maintained. Again, this is not Bible, this is just secular history, but apparently as a way to get around the walls, and this would all have been going on during this feast, somehow, and I don't know how, the Persian army rerouted the Euphrates River. Remember the map I showed you runs right through the city, so that instead of being a barrier out of the city, because you couldn't swim the river, they lowered the level enough so they could just wade through. That allowed them to walk under the gates, right into the city, up into the city pretty much unnoticed because most everybody, 1,000 of them anyway, were at this big feast. Nobody was paying attention. Walked right into the city and took it over. Again, there are various accounts depending on who you read, which story you read. If you read the Babylonian records or if you read the Persian records, obviously the records read a little differently because they tell the story differently. But that's how apparently the city fell. They diverted the river, walked right in, and just like Daniel in his message said, your days are numbered. In fact, he could have even said your hours are numbered because that very night Belshazzar was killed and the empire was lost to the Medes and the Persians. All of this happened exactly the way that Jeremiah the prophet foretold it would, in keeping with what he said. Jeremiah chapter 51, you don't have to turn there, but I'll read verses 33 to 37 to you. This is what Jeremiah said before the exile ever even happened. It says, "For thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, the daughter of Babylon is like a threshing floor at the time when it is trodden. Yet a little while, and the time of her harvest will come. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, has devoured me. He has crushed me. He has made me an empty vessel. He has swallowed me like a monster. He has filled a stomach with my delicacies, and he has rinsed me out. He's taken everything I have. He has digested us, me being Israel and Jerusalem, just completely destroyed us." Verse 35, "The violence done to me and to my kinsmen may be upon Babylon. Let the inhabitants of Zion say. My blood be upon the inhabitants of Chaldea, let Jerusalem say." Verse 36, "Therefore says the Lord, behold, I will plead your cause and take vengeance for you. I will dry up her sea and make her fountain dry. And Babylon shall become a heap of ruins, a haunt of jackals, a horror and hissing without inhabitant." Now the without inhabitant part would happen years later because the Medes and the Persians continued to use the city. That would come true as well. And I don't know if this was meant literally or not, but "I will dry up her sea and make her fountain dry." And sure enough, that's exactly how Babylon fell. They dried up the fountains of the Euphrates, diverted the river, and walked right through. And exactly what Jeremiah and also Isaiah, I won't read that to you, but exactly what the prophet said would come true came precisely true. And Babylon fell just like the prophet said it would. And that very night, Belshazzar was killed. Darius the Mede received the kingdom, and he was about 62 years old. So what do we see from the story? Once again, what do we see from the story? We see another common theme at the end, don't we, that we saw in Daniel chapter 1, Daniel chapter 2, Daniel chapter 3, Daniel chapter 4, and now Daniel chapter 5. What is it? Think to yourself, what's the common theme we always see? God versus Babylon. Who wins? God had several encounters with Nebuchadnezzar the king. Every single time Nebuchadnezzar the king bows to the God of heaven. His successor, Belshazzar, did not listen to history, didn't listen to what God had done to Nebuchadnezzar. And he says, "All right, I will have one more dealing with you, and we'll see who wins." And he comes to Belshazzar and says, "You're done, you've come up short, and I'm taking you out. I'm giving your kingdom to somebody else." That very same night, that exact thing happened. Once again, God is glorified of being the God who puts people up and who takes them down, who gives them glory, who gives them humiliation. And God is the one in charge. Again, keep in mind, this is the Aramaic section, the section that everybody in the kingdom now will read, because it's all in the common language. You're a citizen of the empire, and you see this being read to yourself. After Babylon has fallen, of course, now the nation you live in is of the Medes and the Persians. But what do you see? You read the newspaper and say, "Wow, what's going on here? Things are so chaotic. Armies are running everywhere. Cities are being overthrown. Kingdoms are falling. Other kingdoms are rising up. What a chaotic political system. All the oil in Russia is going away. We don't know if World War III is going to happen." And then you read this account here that's found in Daniel, and you say, what? Oh, yeah. I guess God is kind of the one taking people up, putting people down, giving them honor, giving them humiliation. I guess this was all part of his plan after all, especially if you're familiar with Jeremiah or Isaiah, who said this would happen anyhow. So comforting thing number one, God was in control. Same thing for today. You're a Jewish person who is still in exile, and you read this account. What happens to your mindset? Yeah, God said that Babylon would be overthrown, didn't he? Just like Jeremiah said, sure enough, here it happened. And God gave a warning sign as it was happening, so God takes credit for the overthrow, is basically what it is. God says, I'm ordaining this to happen. King Belshazzar, you're out. I'm putting somebody else in. That exact thing happens. God's still in control, just like he said. He still has a plan. He's still watching over us, and everything is still all good. And yet I wonder, as I look through the chapter, when God dealt with, and this is just my own thinking, when God dealt with Nebuchadnezzar, it was always to give him a chance to repent and come back to him, to see God in a different way, to worship the true God. When God deals with Belshazzar, it is too little too late. Did you notice that? There's really practically nothing that Belshazzar could have done at that point. Why does God bother to give a message to Belshazzar when it's too late for him to do anything about it? The kingdom was already falling. Probably the soldiers were marching through the river at the time that the finger was writing on the wall. Probably so. So why the message? No time for... Yes, I see. Can I just say it's very rare to have somebody raise their hand in this auditorium. Thank you so much for doing that. What do you think?
To make it clear that God did this.
So that God could take credit for the overthrow. I think that's absolutely correct. Yeah. God is signing his name to this revolution, saying, I have done this, or I have ordained this. I've given power to the Babylonians long enough. They've used it to do what I wanted them to do, but now they are wicked, and so I in turn will now what? Overthrow them and take them out and judge them. Just like I used them to judge everybody else, now I'm going to use somebody else to judge them. And we know from Daniel chapter 2, the image, that God will continue to do that throughout history, right? There's one other side, and I think you're exactly right. I think that's why it happened. I think there's another benefit, by the way, that comes from this. The last verse says, Darius the Mede then received the kingdom, being about 62 years old, and in marches the next king. Again, most of what I read for this chapter as I studied actually was taken up with the concept or the question of who was Darius versus who was Cyrus. I'm not even going to get into that. For our purposes, it doesn't matter. But the point is, the next king marches in, and now the next morning we have a new king. And this new king needs to set up a system of government, because you can't just have a power vacuum in an empire. You have to set up your own government, and you have to do it quickly. And he has to choose some people that he knows will be trustworthy and who are competent to run his kingdom. So who do you as the next king select? Well, just the previous night, there was some wise man, some advisor of the previous king who was not only in position for a very long time, but he also has the wisdom and the insight of the gods that he can interpret the writing on the wall. This man of insight, this man of however he does it. Of course, we know it's through God, of course. I doubt that Darius knew that. But he selects Daniel to be over all of his other advisors, all of his other satrapies, I think it calls it in chapter 6, all of his other governors. How do you think he knew to choose Daniel? Probably because he heard of what happened the night before. And he said, that's probably the guy that I want. So two things there. Primarily, I think you're correct. I think God was taking credit for the overthrow, absolutely. I am the one in charge here. I'm the one who raises up and sets down. But also uses it to put Daniel in a very good position so that Daniel, once again, could be transitioned from one administration to another and continue to be effective for God and for God's people in the next empire. Amazing how God does that type of thing. You remember back in the overthrow of Jerusalem, God kind of did the same thing with Jeremiah, didn't he? Jeremiah prophesied against the sins of the people. He said, Babylon will come in and overthrow. And so when Jerusalem was overthrown, the captors heard of what Jeremiah had been saying and how accurate and correct he was, that he was a true prophet, and they treated him very well. All right? The same thing happened with Daniel here. So yes, God was taking control for the overthrow. He's also setting Daniel up for Daniel chapter 6 and on throughout his administration. All right, but once again, God demonstrates his power and identifies himself for who he is, how he is in charge, and he's broadcasting that to the entire empire of what had been Babylon and now is the Medes and the Persians. Let's pray. Dear God, we thank you for this morning, how we can look into the book of Daniel once again, see your power displayed. With Nebuchadnezzar, you dealt with him one-on-one, person to person, and Nebuchadnezzar always bowed. And Nebuchadnezzar saw your strength, and he, if not completely believed in you, we don't know, but at least submitted to you and your authority. He recognized who you were and made the pronouncement to all the kingdom that you are the God who is to be worshipped. Belshazzar never learned the lesson. And I pray that we would learn from other people's mistakes and not suffer and create our own. Help us to recognize who you are and appreciate your power, your greatness, your sovereignty. And even when the world is going all chaotic, things are being overthrown, military is running here and there and everywhere, war is imminent. No matter what happens in our newspapers, we know that you are calling the shots. And in the end, we'll look back and say, aha, yes, God did that as well, and I didn't have to be worried after all. Thank you for this wonderfully insightful book. In Jesus' name I pray, amen.